to The Lamppost Listener. My name is Daniel.
I'm Phil.
And this is a podcast where we are going to be journeying chapter by chapter through C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. In this first season of our show, we're going to be reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And our goal is for listeners, young and old, to be able to enjoy revisiting Narnia, whether this is your first time or your 50th time. Yeah, we're here, Phil. I'm super excited about this. I think we just need to say a couple of things before we just jump right in. Does that sound good?
That sounds good. Let's start with when the book was published.
Yeah. So The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was published in 1950, and we are not going to get into the huge debate over publication versus chronological order. We're going to be reading this in publication order, but if you're interested in even what that debate means, or if you're reading along with us with a physical or even digital copy, and this book says number 2 on it, I actually found a really helpful YouTube video which made the argument for publication order, or even helps you understand why this might say that The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is book number 2. And it made the argument and explanation better than I could. So I'm actually just going to go ahead and link that down in the description for this episode. And you can kind of see why we're choosing publication order here. But I'm really excited to do this, Phil. I think we should just jump right into the first chapter.
Yeah, we plan to start every episode with a short summary of the chapter. Daniel will summarize the odd chapters, and I'll do the even ones. We plan to do around 150 words at the most for the summaries, and we're going to try to keep it to the most important parts just to give you a quick summary of what happened so that you can follow along, even if you're not actively reading each chapter along with us.
Yeah, so our goal is that, maybe you read these books as a kid, and you haven't really reread them as an adult, but you might like revisiting them. So even if you're not really caught up in, I haven't read the chapter recently or anything, this summary should help give you an idea of what happened in that chapter. So let me go ahead and read our very first summary for chapter 1. 4 children are sent to a professor's mansion in the British countryside during the London Blitz. Peter is the eldest and wants to be in charge. Susan is gentle, Edmund is grouchy, and Lucy is both curious and frightened. Peter and Susan are excited to explore the grounds of the mansion. On their first day there, it's raining outside, so the children decide to explore the house instead. Lucy finds an almost empty room while wandering around the mansion. In this room, she finds a wardrobe. When she steps into it, she is surprised to find a forest in the middle of winter. Lucy continues walking through the woods toward an odd lamppost until she comes across a fawn. And that's where we'll end. So let's dive in now, Phil, and walk through this in a little bit more detail. Do you want to start us off, or you want me to go ahead?
You can go ahead and start. Are we going to do the reading through the first paragraph?
Yeah, let's read through that wonderful first paragraph. So the book starts off like this. Once there were 4 children whose names were Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. This story is about something that happened to them when they were sent away from London during the war because of the air raids. They were sent to the house of an old professor who lived in the heart of the country, 10 miles from the nearest railway station and 2 miles from the nearest post office. He had no wife, and he lived in a large house with a housekeeper named Mrs. Macready and 3 servants. Their names were Ivy, Margaret, and Betty, but they do not come into this story much. And I just want to stop right there because I love C.S. Lewis as an author of these books. I love his nonfiction. I love his Christian apologetics and his other adult fiction. And right in that first paragraph, we get an idea of what kind of narrator C.S. Lewis is going to be. I love that we even get the names of these 3 characters who really aren't very important to this story. He just breaks the fourth wall right there in the first paragraph. When you read this, Phil, though, what do you think?
Yeah, so that's one of the things that stood out to me as well, just how he introduces us to the fact that the person who owns the house has a housekeeper and 3 servants, but then quickly dismisses them and says they're not really that important. I like that quite a bit.
Yeah, it's really nice. And I also just want to point out this ideas that C.S. Lewis has here as setting this up. Obviously, this book is taking place during World War II, between, I think it's the fall of 1940 to the spring of 1941, although I might be off on that, that the London Blitz is happening, and the Pevensey children, Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy, they're being forced to go to the country, which is a real thing that happened. And actually, Phil, did you know this? C.S. Lewis, this is kind of a personal thing. Do you know anything about this?
Which part?
This part right here. So he actually hosted 3 young
Oh, yes,
girls
yeah.
in his house in the countryside. Yeah, I didn't know if you knew that or not.
Was one of them named Lucy, and is that who it's dedicated to on the page before chapter 1?
Oh, that's actually a good question. I don't. It is dedicated to someone named Lucy, correct?
That's
But
correct.
I do not know if it's the same Lucy. I think it's like Lucy Barfield. I don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm assuming that the name Lucy is being used because of who it's dedicated to, but I do not know if she was one of the children who went to live with him.
Yeah.
I think he signs it, "Your affectionate godfather." Is that doesn't really give me much of a clue whether or not. I would assume a godfather would have had a relationship with a child since they were very young, and I would think that the children coming during the London Blitz would have been at least a little bit older than toddler, or 5 or 6. Maybe. I mean, it could be actually. That's something
Yeah.
we can look into and talk about next episode.
That may be how the connection happened where they knew where they could send the kids, but I do love that it gives us so much information just in this first paragraph. And I was reading a book by an author recently, and he said that he like rewrote the first paragraph like 700 times. Um, and I wish C.S. Lewis were here because I'd love to ask him how many times he rewrote this, because you cover so much stuff. You get the names of the people, you get the setting and the history in one sentence after that. You know, it's London during the war and there were air raids. That gives you a very clear idea of when exactly this is, what's going on, what the general feeling of the people in the area is like. And then you also get a sense of who the professor is, what his living situation is like, and you also know who's not going to be featured in the story.
Yeah, I would think, Phil, that I wonder if he didn't write this a bunch, because I know one of the as I've been preparing for this podcast, I didn't realize how quickly he wrote these books. That they were things he wrote really quickly, and I think, and we'll get into this definitely in the next episode. One of the difference between him and one of his best friends, J.R.R. Tolkien, is that Tolkien took decades to write The Lord of the Rings and to build up his legendarium, whereas C.S. Lewis just kind of like hashed these out and just kind of in some ways made some things up as he went along. And so I would assume he wrote and did rewrite some things, but part of me kind of likes Narnia, and that it's just this very kind of, oh, I just wrote it and I just went along with whatever I felt at the time.
Yeah. And stuff like that can be extremely powerful. You're familiar with the film The Princess Bride?
Yeah.
So The Princess Bride actually started out as a story that the person who wrote it, Robert, I'm blank on the last name right now, but the person who wrote that movie was telling that story to his kids. And the movie was based on a book that he wrote down, and his wife told him like, write this story down, it's really good, and he never did. He thought he would remember it, and it's actually him trying to remember what that story was. So the story he told his kids was actually even better than The Princess Bride, but it's lost to time.
That's awesome. Um, After the setting has been set up, we get our introduction to the characters. Do you want to, Phil, read some of that, or do you just want us to talk about them?
Sure, yeah. So one of the things that I really enjoyed about this is how at the same time you're finding out their names, you're also finding out their ages in relation to each other, which is what's really important, not exactly what their exact age is. And you learn a little bit about each of them. So let's see. Um, okay, right here. But on the first evening when he came out to meet them at the front door, he was so odd looking that Lucy, who was the youngest, was a little afraid of him. So you find out, her name, her age in relation to everyone else. She's younger than all of them, and her initial feelings, but she's a little afraid, not a lot afraid. Edmund, who was the next youngest, wanted to laugh and had to keep on pretending he was blowing his nose to hide it. So you learn quite a bit about them, and then a few paragraphs later, you find out that Peter's the kind of person who's like, we've fallen on our feet, make no mistake. So he's very optimistic. He's ready for a good time. And then Susan says, I think he's an old dear. And Edmund replies, oh, come off it. So you find out Susan's kind of having this like motherly tone of voice when she's saying stuff. And you can kind of see the role she may be trying to fill. And then Edmund, is coming across as very bad tempered because he doesn't like the way she's trying to be a mother to him.
Yeah, and right off the back, we get an idea about these characters, and you're right, their ages aren't necessarily as important. Although I do have them, and I'll share them really quickly. Peter's 13, Susan's 12, Edmund is 10, and Lucy is 8. But you're right, like that isn't as important. So to give a little even background about why I love this book as much as I do, I actually read this book every year. I'm a 4th grade teacher, and I read this book every year in my class. Um, and one of my favorite parts of the first couple of days when we do this is, we read through the first few chapters, and when we get to this section right here in the first couple of pages, my students automatically just don't like Edmund. Like, oh yeah, he's a jerk. We don't like him. And that's really great because he literally just says, "Oh, come off it." I think that's his first line in the entire thing. They're like, "Oh, that's really mean."
Yeah.
Especially because C.S. Lewis says he's tired and pretending not to be tired. And my students are around 9 or 10, which is about Edmund's age, and they can relate to that. "Oh, yeah, do you guys remember, when you're actually tired or sleepy, but you don't wanna be sleepy, but it actually makes you really grumpy?" And they can relate to that. So right off the bat, C.S. Lewis gives us a good look at each one of these characters and who they're gonna be. And not only that, he begins to set up their stories, and their arcs for this book. We're not gonna go ahead, we're going one chapter at a time, but for Edmund to come in so grouchy and bad-tempered, and for Lucy to be a little, scared but slightly curious, really just begins their, character arcs on literally what, we're on the 2nd page, I think.
Yep. For me, it's the first page, but I'm reading them in the giant version.
Oh, I've got the Kindle version here, so maybe it's just a little different. Actually, technically, it's page 4, but I don't know what that means. Uh,
It's location 2,837 of like
yes, I
200,409 on your Kindle.
I don't understand how Kindles work, but that doesn't if there's when there's thousands of locations, that means nothing to me.
And how do they get all those books in there and it still weighs the same? That's incredible.
So the children decide this is I mean, I can't imagine how fun this would be. They're in this huge mansion in the English countryside, and they're going to go exploring outdoors because there's a lot of woods and grounds all around the mansion. But the next morning, I want to read this right here. But when the next morning came, there was a steady rain falling so thick that when you looked out the window, you could see neither the mountains, nor the woods, nor even the stream in the garden.
Hmm.
And I want to talk about two things there that I really love. One, C.S. Lewis is speaking in second person here. He's saying you could see neither the mountains, nor the woods, nor even the stream in the garden. And again, he's actually not again, but for the first time, he's asking us to enter into the story, right? So as a reader,
Mm.
especially with a book that's written for children, he's asking his audience to enter into this story. So now, when I read this with my students, they are now picturing the mansion itself, and they're like, "Oh yeah, like you can't even." He told me I couldn't see that, and so they're able to relate to that. And I even find myself really enjoying that as well. That I'm able to now put myself in these children's shoes because the author told me to do that. Um, and the second thing is here. We've already talked about this in the summary, but this rain is going to draw the children indoors and particularly draw Lucy into the wardrobe. And one of the things we're going to do on this show, Phil, right, that we talked about is talk a little bit about some of the Christian themes as well here, too. Obviously, the Narnia books are rife with Christian themes. This book might probably be the strongest of those, and we'll get there and we'll talk about them. It's not going to be the whole point of our show, but we do think they're really important to these books. And I think even at the first instance, here in this chapter, we get a sign of kind of divine providence or of, Aslan or Narnia drawing the children in. Like, I don't believe this is a coincidence that it's raining right now. What do you think, Phil?
Sure, yeah. So that's kind of what I noticed as well. You hear Lucy going badgers, and then Edmund's like foxes, and Susan says rabbits. And then the very next sentence is, but when the next morning came, there was this steady rain falling.
Hmm.
And it's like, oh, like you had all these plans and then they changed, but then something really cool might happen. To me, as a Christian, I see that as, God is laughing when you make plans and then he does something that's
Yeah.
even better. Like, I think they are the kind of people who have run around the mountains before and gone into the woods and they would have had a good time, but it kind of would have been expected. And now that they're trapped inside the house, you're forced to be a little more creative, and it ends up, literally taking them to a different world.
Yeah. Let's talk about that different world. Do you want to read a little bit or do you want me to keep reading?
Go ahead.
All right. So The children decide they're going to look all through this house, and we get a lot of description about really just how enormous this house is. And then Lucy kind of wanders off, and she doesn't wander off. She stays behind in a room that has a wardrobe in it. And it says, looking inside, she saw several coats hanging up, mostly long fur coats. There was nothing Lucy liked so much as the smell and feel of fur. She immediately stepped into the wardrobe and got in among the coats and rubbed her face against them, leaving the door open, of course, because she knew that it was very foolish to shut oneself into any wardrobe. Phil, are you familiar with this line in the book?
Well, what I remember is the first time I read it, I thought that I was doing that thing where you accidentally read the same paragraph over and over again. Uh,
Yeah.
because like I heard that line and then you see it a few paragraphs later, I believe, and then you also um, like it may come up again in this chapter, but it seems like it's repeated quite a bit.
Yeah, it is. It's one of the things where I don't know if this is C.S. Lewis being funny here, like if this is written as him being, facetious, and he's like, yeah, it'd be very foolish to do that, and he's then going to use it in the future to show which characters are making good decisions and which characters are making bad decisions. Or I don't know if he's doing it because he's actually worried that some children might read this book and be like, well, we got to go play in the wardrobe. And he's like, well, that's fine. Go play in that wardrobe, but make sure you don't lock yourself in there. And I,
Right.
I kind of think it's the latter, which makes me just love C.S. Lewis even more. That he's built up this great imaginative world, but he still is grounded enough in reality to make sure that children don't lock themselves in wardrobes.
Right. And that's something I do not think about very often until you hear about it being a problem. An example is this.
Was this a problem
Well,
of kids putting themselves in wardrobes?
I remember my mom like pointing out a refrigerator on the side of the road and like sitting me down and being like, "Do not close yourself in a refrigerator." And I was like, "Mom, I'm not like, why would I ever do that?" But apparently, people have died that way, and that's terrible. Um, and it's probably like a very small percentage compared to the population or other deaths, but like it is a thing that happens. And you think about a book as popular as this. I mean, if I was a little kid, I might try to like go in a wardrobe. I don't know if it's as dangerous as a refrigerator where there's no air circulation at all, but
Yeah.
also like I guess we just don't have wardrobes, but it seems
I don't,
like it would be
yeah.
pretty easy to get out of a wardrobe from the few that I've seen.
Yeah, I just figured you just could. Well, I don't know. Maybe it doesn't have a handle on the other side. That's the thing. Like when I think of my closet in my house, like in my wife and I's master bedroom, there's a handle on the other side. So if you walk in, you can walk back out. But with some of these, there might not. It might be more like a cabinet, and so I guess that could be an issue there. But either way, I love that C.S. Lewis has thought this through, and it's not like we come across this once. This is a phrase that appears multiple times throughout this book. I think it might be four. I don't remember. I'm reading these just one chapter at a time as we go through these, but I do read this book every year with my class, and so I'm trying to think ahead to the last time I read it with my class, and I think it might come up four times,
We're
which
not just
is
being weird bringing it up. It's
yeah,
repeated quite a bit, and we're pointing out how weird that is.
yeah. So let's keep moving. So
Sure.
she starts, to walk in, and as she walks into the wardrobe, she can keep walking further and further back, and we get this wonderful scene of her then all of a sudden, or not all of a sudden, but slowly kind of enter into this snowy wood. And the text says, Lucy felt a little frightened, but she felt very inquisitive and excited as well. She looked back over her shoulder, and there, between the dark tree trunks, she could still see the open doorway of the wardrobe and even catch a glimpse of the empty room from which she had set out. And then here we go. In parentheses, she had, of course, left the door open, for she knew that it was a very silly thing to shut oneself into a wardrobe.
Exactly 3 paragraphs later.
Yeah, exactly. And so Lucy decides, I can always go back, and she keeps walking into the woods. And then we get this last paragraph here. I'm going to read the very end of it. In about 10 minutes, she had reached it and found it was a lamppost. As she stood looking at it, wondering why there was a lamppost in the middle of a wood and wondering what to do next, she heard a pitter-patter of feet coming toward her. And soon after that, a very strange person stepped out from among the trees into the light of the lamppost. And that's where the chapter ends. Phil, tell me about your first Do you remember reading this book for the first time? This is kind of the big magical transition to Narnia. Do you have any memory of this as a child?
So I do
Not of going there
remember.
yourself, but
Yeah. So I actually went to this professor's house during the air raids, and
oh wow, you
um, I had some Turkish delight. I'm kidding. So I don't remember this chapter in particular. I do remember having these books read to me as a kid, both by my dad, which was a great memory. We went through several of them. We also watched the BBC versions of the movies, which we'll talk about throughout this
we will
book.
definitely talk about the BBC versions.
And then I also remember the movie coming out in 2005, the Disney version,
Mhm.
where they really brought things to life. With more modern technology than I forget when the BBC one was, but it's probably
I
like
think it was
80s or
late
90s.
80s. Yeah, it was late
Late
80s,
80s.
I think.
Yeah. But I do remember. And we'll talk about this more in the next chapter. Like this is just such a great way of drawing people in because I can relate to being at a big house and being bored. Like you go to visit someone, you go to visit a grandparent, and it like when you're a kid, everything just seems like it's much larger. And then kind of having this free time because it's raining or you don't always have an activity to do, and just kind of wandering around, you let your imagination go. But I really love how Lucy is literally drawn into the wardrobe, and it goes from the fur, and then it gets a little bit colder, and she feels the branches, and then she's in that world. And then she sees the fawn, and I love how you get like a short little description of him, and you can see some stuff and the parcels. And then the fawn goes, "Goodness gracious me!" And it's like, okay, now you're like kind of the roller coaster has just begun. You're like, wait, what? And I'm ready to turn the next page already.
Yeah, and you just reminded me, reading on my Kindle, I said we were at the end of this chapter and we actually still have like 2 more pages. My Kindle I think just like messed up and it ends right there. So, but you're right, she does go on and meet um we sees a fawn and then we just hear him say goodness gracious me. But that's really cool that you kind of, remember that and that you had that memory of your dad reading that to you. And I think this is kind of just the part for me as a child and when I've in a weird way, I've experienced this much more with other children than I ever have, myself. I only read this once as a kid, maybe twice, but
Did you
I've
read it
now
to
read it.
yourself, or did
Yeah, I
someone read
read
it
it to
to you?
myself in the 1st grade. No.
Nerd.
Yeah. I probably had it read to me once and then probably read it to myself as a kid. But now, in my adulthood, I've read it, goodness gracious me, 5 or 6 times. I mean, a lot like, in the past couple of years,
Yep.
I've read it much more as an adult, which is interesting because these are books that can be enjoyed by all ages, but are written primarily for children. And I feel like I've engaged with them much more as an adult than I ever did as a child. Um, but as we were talking about that, Phil, you made me think about, um, just as you were talking about your imagination and being in like an old house and stuff like that. It made me think about um, this first vision of the lamppost that Lucy has, combining both sisters' names that Lucy has, and it makes me think about again to go back to J.R.R. Tolkien. It makes me think about um, him and Lewis and the different ways that they crafted each other's worlds, or crafted their own worlds, I should say. So we get this lamppost in the middle of the woods, and then C.S. Lewis just kind of goes on like he acknowledges that there's a lamppost there, and then the story just keeps moving quickly. And we don't really have a lot of answers, to why that lamppost is there. And I know we find out more in other books, but here in this book, we don't have any answers. Like, where does this source of gas come from? Or is this electric? Like,
Yeah.
Narnia seems to be kind of a medieval kind of technological place. So, like, what's happening there, which is really different than how Tolkien built and filled out Middle Earth, because it's a much more extensive world in some ways. And as I've been thinking about this, and as we've been preparing for the podcast, I realized I really enjoy both.
Right.
Um, with Tolkien, I'm creating a world in my head based off of his numerous descriptions and these fictional histories and all these details. Right, I'm not as much transferring words, or I guess I should say this: I'm not filling my imagination as much as I just am transferring his words into my imagination. Like, it's really apparent that Tolkien knew what was going on, even if the events didn't necessarily correlate to the book you're reading, right? So there's things happening in The Hobbit, like Gandalf visiting Dol Guldur, which don't show up in that book, but he knows that they're happening. Whereas with Lewis, I feel like I'm filling in large gaps of knowledge about the world with my own thoughts. And it almost, in some ways, gives me a little bit more ownership of this world because I get to answer some of the questions that Lewis doesn't. And I think as children, this is a really intriguing thing, right? Like you get to kind of become part of this world. Does that make
Right.
any sense?
I think that it definitely does. For me, I have a background in illustration, and I grew up reading comics. I read comics in the newspaper, but I also read comic books, and then what is now referred to as graphic novels, much longer things. So you have a panel, and then you have another panel, and you don't have every single frame, every single split second drawn between the two panels, but the reader will fill that in their own mind. So you have someone, standing and smiling, and then someone else frowning, and you kind of connect the two automatically. Moving to say a movie, that still kind of happens because you have 24 frames per second with an
Mm-hmm.
animated film, and your mind is still filling stuff in. It's a little different because like you're more in control of the timing there. But I love stuff like that because it really does require something of you as a viewer, especially when you're reading. So when you're reading, you're making up almost everything in your head, and we have some pretty good illustrations in this book at the top of every chapter. But you're you're having something described to you. You're having some events described to you, and you fill stuff in here and there. And I think that Tolkien had a good approach too, where he had everything figured out, and he would reference stuff. And the reason it works so well is he had it all figured out. So it kind of made sense even if you didn't know exactly what happened. And then if he did choose to explain stuff later, it would all connect. I think J.K. Rowling does the same thing very well. Lewis does it in a different way where he doesn't fill in all the details, which requires more of the viewer. And, who knows what he actually had planned out because it sounds like he did fill in some gaps later on. But it's not an easy thing to do because it's very easy to be like, on the other side of it, I'm not going to give you any details and you're just going to have to guess everything. And sometimes I find myself doing that. I'm like, no, I need to explain a little bit more. Like if I'm making a comic page, I'm like, I need to add a background because I can't just assume that everyone's going to figure out what the background is. Or I need to explain this a little bit more because people aren't getting it at all. And you can very quickly fall out of the story if something doesn't make sense.
Yeah, that's really good. I think it's going to be really fun for us to talk through this with my background as an educator and your background as an illustrator and as an art school student and stuff, or art school graduate, excuse me. I'm sending you back a couple of years.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be really fun to talk about this book because I think we both come at this with very different perspectives, even at the things that we're kind of drawn to.
Sure.
Phil, do you have
And
any last thoughts before we end the chapter?
I do. Let me see if I can bring it up.
Okay.
Okay, so one thing that does stand out to me, and I've noticed this more reading a different book that's also kind of fantasy based, is every chapter would lead into the next chapter in a way that there's kind of a cliffhanger. It's like when you're watching a TV show, right before the commercial break, something will happen, and the reason you come back so quickly or like stay during the commercials is you're wondering like what happened, how are they possibly going to resolve that. For this one, it's a question. Like, who is this fawn? We know what it looks like, and we know what it says, and it talks kind of funny, at least, from an American perspective in the modern era. It says, "Goodness gracious me," and it exclaims. It doesn't just kind of mutter it under its breath. So now I want to know what happens. And I'm also like, where are we? I have all these questions. And reading through this chapter in preparation for this podcast, I kept going. I was like, I really want to find out what happened. Even though I only needed to read one chapter at a time and start taking notes, I read for quite a bit longer.
No, that's cool. Yeah, I really like the um, serialized format of a lot of these chapters, like you said. But one thing that'll be interesting, and we'll talk about it when we get to these chapters, is I I don't mean this word to be negative, but I think when I think of the Chronicles of Narnia, a lot of times I think of the word inconsistent, and that sounds bad. I don't mean it in a negative way. I mean it just in there's not a particular formula that Lewis follows. Like we're not talking about the other books right now, but a lot of the books don't follow this, same kind of formula. The approach to the story might be different. And even in this book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the chapters are different. Like we're going to have chapters later on in the book that literally abruptly end in the middle of a conversation and then just pick up on the other conversation, like pick up the conversation on just the next page in a different chapter. And then we have ones like these that end on kind of a cliffhanger, like, oh my goodness. And then we have ones where there's kind of a passage of time between the chapters. So there's not a consistency there. And I don't mean that, again, in a bad way. I really like that it kind of keeps me guessing and that Lewis is creating this world really without any rules. Like there isn't, Tolkien or J.K. Rowling, they all had these different, rules that we're following in these worlds. And Lewis is not necessarily following those. And I should say here that you and I, although we both love these books and love C.S. Lewis, we are not scholars of Narnia. So someone might, say, well,
Yet.
maybe there's someone listening, like screaming at their phone right now, like, no, he planned all this out. And if he did, I guess I'm wrong, which is totally fine. We are definitely not scholars here. We're just two people who love this book.
Right.
So Phil, now that we're here at the end of the chapter, I think it'll be helpful for us to kind of end each episode just naming where we are and where we're going. So this chapter ends, Phil, with Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. Peter, Susan, and Edmund all still in the professor's house, and Lucy now having come across this strange creature. We don't know its name or anything yet. Phil, where are we going next time?
We're going to find out more about the fawn, see how the fawn interacts with Lucy. We'll find out the fawn's name, so stay tuned. And we'll also learn a little bit more about the world we just entered into.
So that's going to be the end of our episode for today. If you want to follow us into the world of Narnia, you can do so on our Facebook or Twitter pages. You can also email us at thenarniapodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear your thoughts on chapters, on themes, or even just your history and relationship with this particular book. We are just going to stick with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe in our first season. So try to keep your thoughts and feelings with that book right now, and then we definitely will read through all of these books. But we'd love to hear our listeners' thoughts. We'd also appreciate it if you could give us a review on iTunes, or I think it's actually called Apple Podcasts now.
Yep.
That helps other listeners find the show and join in our read-through. Our show's main theme was created by Kevin MacLeod. You can find more of his work in the link at the bottom of this episode's description. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey. We will see you next time in Chapter 2.
See you then.